Next talk will be in English. So we'd like to remember that we have simultaneous translation devices, the headsets. I invite to the stage the ISG director, Michael Costello. His talk will be about how the chemical industry is reducing the environmental footprint of leather.
Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. Now you need your headphones if you don't understand English. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Costello. And we heard from Elena and from Kim the importance of chemicals in the impact of leather. So today we'll look into that a little bit. If you exclude the impact of the animal, then the chemicals is by far the most important impact on the environmental footprint of leather. So this will increase as we go forward. And I think it's really important to investigate the impact of chemicals, not just by reducing chemicals, but by reducing their impact. So that's what we'll talk about today. Now, the chemical industry is doing many things to reduce the environmental impact of leather. One of the things we do is we try to stay ahead of legislation. So whenever legislation is coming, we try to be ahead by 2, 3, 4, or 5 years so that we can anticipate changes and help you to anticipate those changes. The bisphenol technology, the bisphenol-free technology, is a good example of how the chemical industry has stayed ahead of legislation and was prepared for the legislation before it was implemented. So we also innovated ahead of time with a strong pipeline of research. And of course, the chemical industry is very involved in the conformance initiatives in the industry like ZDHC and the Leather Working Group. But today, we will focus on the impact of emissions. So the climate impact of chemicals. That will be our focus for the next few minutes. So here's a pie chart that shows the global greenhouse gas emissions of industry from key sectors in the industry. Now, most of this is energy and transport. Yeah? Then you have iron and steel. Down here, you see petrochemicals. That's the big chemical industry. So our chemical industry is a specialty industry. It's a small part of petrochemicals. And then the leather industry, chemicals, is even a smaller part. So it's actually a very small part of this pie, but as we saw already, it's an important part of the leather process. So this is why we focus on the emissions. And really, the reduction of emissions started with the climate change agreement in Paris in 2015. And this was the real point of inflection in the industry, because for the first time, the world agreed to a set of targets in order to maintain global warming below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial times. So right now, the Earth is at about 1.1 or 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times. So in order to keep global warming below 2 degrees, we need to reduce emissions. We cannot keep going the way we're going. We need to reduce emissions. And that is the key objective of the Paris Climate Agreement, and that has led to many different initiatives. One of those initiatives, you may have heard this, is an organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this organization was formed after the Paris Climate Agreement, And what it does is it ensures that any company who makes a commitment or a target for reducing emissions is properly aligned to the Paris Climate Agreement. So you cannot just make a target and say, I will reduce my emissions by 20%. What this company does is it asks you to submit your target, they check if you're measuring it properly, and then they validate your target according to the Paris Climate Agreement. That's what the SBTI does. And this is an example of a chemical company, our chemical company, the targets that we have. If you don't know what Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions are, there's a lot of information on that. But let me just briefly explain. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are the direct emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, in your factories, in your activities. The light, the energy, the gas, the steam that run your factory. Scope 3 emissions, these are the emissions that are outside your immediate control. You can influence them, but you do not control them. For example, the raw materials that you buy. Those are outside your immediate control, but they are considered Scope 3 emissions. So let's look at the emissions of a typical chemical company. I'll give you a guess which one it is. But this would be the same for all chemical companies. Well, what do you see here? Really interesting. Nearly all of the emissions of a chemical company, 98%, is from Scope 3 emissions. So the factory, the transport, all of these other things doesn't have much impact. The big impact for a chemical company is the chemical raw materials that we buy. The products that we buy to make our chemicals is most of the carbon footprint of a chemical company. So it makes sense that that is where we focus, not so much on our own factories and the energy that we use, although we do that, but the big impact is from the chemical raw materials that we buy. So you can see here where it all starts, yeah? This is where we are. So we need to get our chemicals from the chemical industry in a way that is lower emissions. There are many different ways. We can give those chemicals, and I'll talk now about how we do the data. We give those to the tanneries. So the tannery Scope 3 impact is the chemicals, and then that goes through the supply chain to the consumer. So this is how we contribute to the climate agreement in Paris. How do we reduce those emissions then? Well, first of all, we have to get data, collect data, good data, hopefully, from our suppliers. That's not always easy, but that's what we're trying to do. Getting good data from our suppliers. We cannot improve unless we first measure. So to measure, we need the good data. Then, we try to replace some raw materials, if it's possible, with another one that has a lower impact. Hopefully it's not more expensive, and hopefully it works. Only then will we introduce that product and bring it to the market. And then we can redesign our products using life cycle assessment, and I will show you how that works, so that we can then innovate with new technologies. So that's how it works. But the most important thing was the first point. How do we get data from our suppliers? These are sometimes very big chemical companies, but sometimes they're not big chemical companies. So there are three sources of data that we get. Yeah? First of all, there's a database called EcoInvent. It's a database of chemicals that you can use to get life cycle data, carbon footprint data, from a long list of basic commodity chemicals. And that's very helpful. But it doesn't cover many of the specialty chemicals that we need. So the most important thing is to get good data from our suppliers. And that's where we focus our energy. If we can get good, what we call primary data from our suppliers, then we can get good quality data for you, for the industry, which will help everybody reduce the footprint. So that's really the focus of our efforts now. It's not so much on reducing the emissions, but that will come. It's more on getting good quality data. That's our priority right now. However, sometimes the database doesn't have data for the chemical that you're buying, and sometimes the supplier does not give you data. So in that case, we have to make an averaged calculation. So we combine all of this together, yeah? And we've been using Spin 360 to help us with a lot of this data collection also. So that they've also been an important part of this journey to get better data. But what's really important, very important for the chemical companies, is that this data is the same data that's used for two things. First of all, to calculate our corporate carbon footprint, what we report every year in our sustainability reports. So the carbon footprint of the company. But the same data is also used to calculate the product carbon footprint for our products, which we give to you so that you can input the data, as we saw in Kim's presentation, into your system and get the environmental footprint of leather on a high quality. So the same data is used for two different things, and that's really important. Then, of course, we calculate life cycle assessment for our products. And we use the standard guidelines for ISO, like the whole industry does. And we have 2 people dedicated to this in our company. It's a huge amount of work, but we think it's a very valuable service to the industry. We split the data into different categories. Some customers only want climate change data. Other customers want the full LCA. So we have that ability already. So this is what the chemical industry is doing, and typically we provide declarations like this. This is an example of a declaration. You can't see the number, but it's one of the products. And down here you see what the global warming potential is, and we give that data to our customers transparently, no problem. We don't need special secrecy agreements about that. We will provide data to customers freely. And that's how we do it. But then, really important, what do we do with that data? Because, as I said before, our focus is to provide good quality data, but then, of course, we need to improve, right? We need to reduce the impact of our products. So we have to analyze the data and dig into the hotspots. We saw the hotspots of the leather process, chemicals, maybe retanning chemicals. Maybe that's the area in the leather process. Well, what I've done here is I've taken a typical finishing technology, leather finishing. It's a water-based polyurethane. We do the LCA analysis. I have simplified this, but what we find in the LCA analysis is that the raw materials are most of the impact. The production of the product and all the other things, relatively small impact. Most of the impact is from raw materials. So what about if we split the raw materials to find out which one of the raw materials is the hotspot? And we find in this case that there are 2 chemical elements to the raw materials which are the most impactful. And those are polyols and the isocyanates in the case of a polyurethane top coat. So therefore, we tell our research staff to focus on those 2 groups of chemicals. So therefore, most of the research that we do is to find bio-based or low-carbon versions of these two types of chemicals. So that's how it works. We focus our suppliers on getting good data. We check the data, we validate the data, we convert that data into a corporate carbon footprint, which is reported transparently every year, and then the same data is used to calculate the life cycle impact of our products so that you can calculate your emissions. In summary, the chemistry contribution is critical for leather making. First of all, we try to stay ahead of any legislation, and I mentioned the bisphenol-free technology as a good example of how that works. We have bisphenol-free technology. The legislation has not been applied yet, but we're ready to go. We're committed to conforming with the industry standards, brand-led initiatives like ZDHC and the Leather Working Group, and the chemical industry is very much involved in those. We report our corporate greenhouse gas emissions transparently. We have sustainability reports every year, and we're completely open about the emissions that our company generates and our plans to reduce them. You can look it up on the websites. It's open and free to look at. And finally, we use life cycle assessment to really calculate, analyze, and reduce the impact of our products in your leather manufacturing process. Not just reduce the impact of our products, but also help you to reduce the overall impact of your process, maybe even by using less chemicals, maybe by using less energy with the chemicals used in a different way. So this is the service that the chemical industry is offering to the industry. Thank you very much for your attention.